Hi, hello and welcome. I'm starting a new series. I figured out that my favorite thing to do is series because then I have a specific theme, I have a goal, and then I can do multiple videos within that theme. And this is going to be sort of like an extension to the pet pairing series because we are going to be pairing Pat McGrath palettes, but there's going to be a theme to it as well. So this series is going to be, as you've already seen from the title, a cross between two of my favorite things, Pat McGrath labs and green eyeshadows. I'm just going to do a number of looks centered around green eyeshadow. As of now, I have not quite yet decided if I'm going to do a week off and post these videos consequentially, or if I'm going to do these videos once or twice a week as I would usually do my pet pairing series, but then just you know, have these like green eyeshadow centered looks. I've not quite decided on that yet, so I'm not sure what you're going to be seeing in the future. Mariam is going to decide, but I'm just going to start playing with makeup, and I'm going to start with, as usual, my eyeshadow primer. I'm going to take the Inglot eyeshadow keeper, and in my own timeline, when we're starting this series, I just posted a pet pairing video last week where I talked about a book that I am currently reading, which is called Quarantine, and it explores a couple of very interesting scientific concepts. I'm not going to reiterate what the book is about, I'm just going to leave a link to my previous pet pairing. We're not going to talk about that book anymore because I'm still reading the book. I still haven't finished it. I think I'm on the last stretch now, but I haven't finished it yet. However, in that video, I mentioned that I also really enjoy reading books about science, so not just science fiction, but books about science, and I have very specific interests when it comes to books about science. First of all, I absolutely love books about scientific discoveries. For my foundation today, I'm actually going to do a bit of a mix of the Estee Lauder Double Wear in the shade 2N1 together with my Prada Reveal in the shade LN5. So, books about scientific discoveries, absolutely love them. I'm now trying to think of like all the books about scientific discoveries that I've read in the past that I've really enjoyed. I can give you two examples that immediately, come to my mind. One of my absolute favorite books about scientific discoveries was a book written by a lady whose name, it's terrible, I can't remember the name of the author, but I will leave the titles of all the books in my description box, so if you're interested in any of them, you can easily find them. I know the title of the book though. The title of the book is The Forever Fix, and it is possible that I've mentioned this book before, but I loved that book so much. The Forever Fix essentially centers around the history of gene therapy, like gene replacement therapy. And I absolutely loved that book because it was written in such a interesting way where it combined the scientific facts, but there was a lot of like the human story behind it, because a lot of gene therapy has been driven by desperate parents whose children have genetic diseases and nobody has any options for them. There's no cure. So the author of the book interviewed a lot of the parents, so a lot of these stories were really centered around the patients and their histories. So I absolutely loved that book. I've reread parts of it multiple times, and I keep bragging about it because I think it's really cool that the very first successful gene therapy was applied to an inherited retinal degeneration disease, and I study, well, part of the things that I study are retinal degeneration. Now, it was not specifically the subcompartment of the photoreceptors that I study. It's another cell layer within the retina where an enzyme is dysfunctional, and they correct it for the dysfunctional enzyme by replacing it with a functional one. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of like the scientific nerdy details of the book too much. You can go and read it, but I think it's really cool that and gene therapy had a very loaded history. I'm just briefly going to mention that there was a lot of hope for gene therapy in the late 90s, and then I think in the year 2000 they treated a patient who had not a mild, but a condition that he could live with the correct diet. So his condition was not immediately life-threatening. They treated him with gene therapy, and it was at a time when people were just too excited, maybe a bit too impatient, and they hadn't thought about all the different aspects of the therapy. So They did the therapy, the boy died because of a very severe immune reaction to the virus that they used in order to introduce the gene that they wanted to replace. And that essentially put a halt on gene therapy for like a whole decade. It was like the Middle Ages of gene therapy. And she just tells the story in such an engaging way. I absolutely loved that book. So if you want to read a really cool book about, you know, gene therapy, then I highly recommend The Forever Fix. A book that I don't recall the title of, so I'm going to have to go and look it up. I'm going to take the Dior Skin Correct in the shade 1 and for my concealer today, as usual. The other book that, again, I like I said, I don't recall the title, but I do recall that it was about the discovery of the BRCA mutations. So, you know that a lot of times breast cancer is caused by genetic mutations which are inherited. And this was known for a while because you could see the pattern, that there is a pattern of inheritance there. But especially in like the early 90s, when people were hunting for genes that cause genetic diseases, there was a lot of competition, there was a lot of, you know, excitement. And specifically the history of BRCA is again a very interesting one because it was competition between academic research and a company, and I think the company eventually found the mutations in the genes first. Then for a while they had this like commercial kit for testing, I think, for BRCA mutations. There was like a whole ethical and moral dilemma whether you can patent genes. And that all started, I think, with the BRCA mutations. But these two books were sort of off topic. Really the books that I wanted to discuss today. So I started off by saying that my interests lie in several different areas. So historical discoveries, obviously genetics, molecular biology, you know, things that pertain to what pulls on the strings of my heart, which is molecular biology. And finally, out of nowhere, a couple of years ago, I developed an absolute deep fascination with astrophysics and astronomy, so I love reading books about astrophysics. I'm going to leave the astrophysics recommendations for another time, but today I'm going to talk about molecular biology, and I'm going to talk about one specific author. I was introduced to this author already quite some years ago because the first book that I received to read from him was a present from my internship supervisor many years ago. So this is also a book that is quite up in the years already. I forgot to tell you that I used my Prada Reset Rebalancing Powder to set my foundation. The book that I'm referring to is called The Emperor of All Maladies, and the writer, the author of the book is an MD. His name is Siddhartha Mukherjee, and I really hope that I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but I cannot be entirely sure. I hope so. Again, I'm going to leave all the titles in the books in the description box below so you can find them and you can see for yourself. But I was gifted this book, and then it took me a couple of years actually before I read it, and I don't really know why. Maybe I was just like focused, I think I was focused on improving my Dutch, so I was only reading books in Dutch at the time when I was gifted this book. But then after I read it, I was obsessed with him and I could not wait for him to release another book. So Siddhartha is an MD, and his specialty is, he's an oncologist. And I think more specifically his field of interest is hematological cancers and immune therapies for hematological cancers. And for those of you who don't know that, I did my PhD, so my PhD project was focused on myelodysplastic syndromes and acute myeloid leukemia. So I also have like an interest in blood cancers. And The Emperor of All Maladies is not centered around blood cancer. So The Emperor of All Maladies is his first book. He has published 2 more afterwards, and I hope he's going to release another one at some point in the future. But The Emperor of All Maladies centers around the biography of cancer. I'm going to take my Mario bronzer, the Soft Sculpt Transforming Skin Enhancer in the shade Light Medium, to use as my bronzer type of shade. And I want to preface this by saying that you can write about science in many different ways. There are, you know, well-written books, and then there are exceptionally written books. And Siddhartha has a knack for writing scientific books in such an engaging way that you feel like you're reading a story with plot twists at every corner, at every turn, and you just can't wait to read the next chapter. That's how I have felt about all the 3 books that I have read from him. And it could be that's because I have like a personal interest in the topic, but I honestly think that he just writes in a very engaging way. If you're interested in the topic, then I would highly recommend to read The Emperor of All Maladies. That book literally takes you from the early, like literally the ancient history of cancer, which may refer to our knowledge of the disease for thousands of years. And he takes you literally through all the stages. He describes, you know, the first discoveries of the disease, how especially in the past when there was literally no even hope for a cure and people had no idea what to do with cancer. Cancer wasn't really talked about. At some point, people also realized that there is hereditary, you know, component to it, that some cancers, you know, manifest in the same family over several generations, and that was about it. And then a lot of, you know, progress was made in the late 19th century and especially in the 20th century when genetics came along. And not only did they realize that there is a strong genetic component to cancer, but they realized that cancer is a disease of our genes. He takes you through like so many different interesting aspects of our history with cancer. From the disease itself, the genetic causes of the disease, how we figured out those genetic causes, to the first treatments for cancer, which were performed in the early 20th century, I want to say on pediatric oncology patients. For my blush today, I'm going to take Flirtatious from Pat McGrath Labs. So the first chemotherapy treatments were, I think, used on, you know, these pediatric oncology patients, so kids who had acute leukemias, and they didn't really have any other options to live. And it also puts things in a very interesting perspective, in the sense that in the early 20th century, and it's crazy to think about it now, but in the early 20th century, there was no such thing as informed consent. There was no such thing as double-blinded clinical trials. No such thing existed. So it was like, okay, we have this new drug. We think that it might kill the cancer cells. You have no other option. Should we give it to your kids? And that's how, you know, cancer therapies were born. He also has a very interesting chapter on tobacco and smoking in the 70s, and how, even though at one point scientists figured out that there is a very strong, you know, link between tobacco, smoking, and lung cancers, the increased risk for lung cancers, tobacco companies did their absolute best to silence them and to promote the exact opposite, that tobacco was very healthy for you. So it was very, it's such an interesting chapter, because I didn't really realize how it was actually promoted, that like smoking was promoted as a very healthy habit, even though at the time already the companies that produced tobacco were already aware of the fact that there is a very strong, and it's very difficult, like, to prove a link between an environmental factor and cause for cancer is very difficult. There are a few that are very strongly linked to each other, and tobacco is one of the strongest links between, you know, increased risk of the disease and, you know, this environmental habit. But it was such an interesting chapter as well. And then he goes, you know, through whatever was the modern history of cancer treatments in the 2010s. Since then, I think we've come a long way, and he actually touches upon that in his third book. I'm going to take my beloved Lunar Nude to highlight. So yeah, I learned a lot from this book, and I honestly would gladly go back and reread it. The only reason I don't reread The Emperor of All Maladies often is because I have it on paper, and his other two books I have on my iPad, so I can just read them at any time, because I usually read in the evenings before I go to bed, and a lot of the times I read when my husband is already sleeping, and in order for me to read a paper book I would have to turn on the night lamp, and, you know, practicalities like this preclude me sometimes from rereading chapters from The Emperor of All Maladies, but I would really like to. I might eventually just buy it as an ebook, because I love that book so much and I would love to reread chapters of it. I'm going to quickly set all the products on my face with a little bit of Fix Plus on my sponge here, and then we can start on the look. And the second book from him that I read, which I think might be my favorite, like if I had to rank his books, the book that he released as second is my personal favorite. I call it the Bible, and I gift it to literally all of my students in the past couple of years. So everyone who's had an internship with me gets this book as a present at the end of their internship. The book is called The Gene. Okay, getting started on the eye look, I'm first going to take my Subliminal palette and I'm going to take the satin taupe shade here in the middle, and I'm going to just use a fluffy brush because I want to apply that shade in basically the outer half of my lid and a little bit through my crease. So the gene is, once again, oh, I don't know how he does that. So he starts the book with like his personal history with genetics. There is mental disease running in his family, and as you know, mental disease is one of those that has a strong hereditary component to it, and I don't know what's going on here. I think there was a little bit of eyeshadow primer that was still here. It's fine, you're not going to see it in a little bit because I'm going to cover it with other things, but it is still very annoying when that happens. You know, when the little eyeshadow primer gathers in your little folds on your lids. Anyway, the gene. So like I said, it starts with personal history of why he's interested in genes and genetics, and then it takes you through a multitude of chapters where he talks about, you know, the start of genetics. He takes you, of course, through a whole chapter where he talks about our favorite monk, Gregor Mendel, and his piece. Has this incredibly interesting chapter that I've reread several times on the start of recombinant DNA technology, and there was a fascinating chapter about the discovery of the Huntington gene, so the hunt for what causes Huntington's disease, which was initiated by a woman who has Huntington disease running in the family. I'm not sure that they've made movies about it yet, but I have read the story of that discovery several times, but it's still a fascinating one. So just to give context, Huntington's disease is dominant genetic disease, meaning that if a parent has the disease, their offspring has a 50-50 chance of having the disease themselves, and it is devastating. And nobody knew exactly what the genetic cause of Huntington's disease is, so not only was there absolutely no hope for any sort of cure, but there was also no way to predict if, you know, your parent had Huntington's disease, would you get it yourself? And that took them to this like really remote village somewhere in South America where 1 in 12, I want to say, people suffered from Huntington's disease because it's a small village, people interbreed a lot, and that serves as a driver to maintain the disease. So that's basically the perfect population to start to study the genetic component of the disease. Okay, I think I'm going to leave my lids at this stage now, and I'm going to apply a little bit of glitter glue for the next shade. So, usually populations like this, either families where the disease runs quite often, or even like a whole population like this, like a village, can be a very useful resource if you're trying to find out what the genetic causes of genetic disease. So they went there, they did a bunch of genetic linkage analysis because, again, it was the 90s and genetic technology hadn't progressed to the stages that it is in now. Hunting for genes literally took decades to narrow down the region where the mutation might be located. You may liken this to looking for the needle in the haystack. So they started looking for the needle in the haystack and they found this gene, and they found that a very specific defect is the one that manifests as a disease. Like the gene has these repeats, repeats of cytosine, adenine, guanine, CAG, and that depending on the amount of repeats you get or you don't get the disease. Like within a certain range of repeats, it's all normal, and then as soon as you have more, the disease manifests. And the more the repeats, the younger the disease manifests. So in this village in South America, there were children as early as 12 years who already manifested, you know, symptoms of Huntington's disease. I'm going to now grab a little shader brush, and I'm going to go into the, gosh, why do I forget? Starstruck Splendor. This is the holiday palette for 2023, and I'm going to take this beautiful green over here. I really love the undertone of this shade. It's a beautiful, like very gray toned green. And I'm going to put that here in the inner portion of the lid because I'm going for, you know, a very cool toned green taupe look. And I'm still annoyed at that little gathering of eyeshadow here, but I'm going to cover that with a little bit more of the taupe shade with the taupe shade from Subliminal, so that hopefully you don't see that line anymore. And finally, last year, Siddhartha released a new book. The book is called The Song of the Cell, and I obviously devoured it within a couple of months. By the way, now dipping back into the taupe shade from Subliminal, specifically here to cover a little bit that line. And I'm going to also just mix the two shadows here in the center of the lid. But I'm going to also do a little bit of a fun layering in a sec. So yeah, the Song of the Cell takes you through obviously like a different level. It goes from, you know, genetics into cellular biology, and, you know, it's split again in different chapters, which are recounts of a variety of different discoveries pertaining to cellular biology, from just discovering that we are made of organs, which are made of tissues, which are made of cells. That was already super mind-blowing to people. There was a really exciting chapter about IVF, the discovery, and like the start of IVF was absolutely wild and absolutely bonkers. You should definitely read that chapter. Or I've heard that there is actually a movie on Netflix which tells the story of how IVF started that I can't wait to watch. I'm actually going to take a little bit of that taupe shade also on my lower lashes, and I'm just going to clean off the flat shader brush and run a little bit of that taupe here on my lower lash line. Nothing too complicated. And in The Song of the Cell, he goes back to the more modern therapies for cancer, such as, you know, the CAR-T therapies, the immune-based therapies for cancer, which are definitely something of the 2020s. And yeah, if I had to rank his books, like I said, The Gene is my favorite, then The Emperor of All Maladies, and finally The Song of the Cell. I loved all three of them. Ranking them doesn't mean that I enjoyed one then less than I enjoyed the other, but, you know, just like pulling on personal strings, The Gene was my absolute favorite. I'm going to go back into Subliminal now, and I'm going to take a little bit of Astral White here, but just the absolute tiniest bit. I don't want this shade to overtake in any sort of way, but I do want to add a little bit of a few fun sparkles here, just in the center of the lid. Ooh, that looks really fun. Especially Astral White over that green shade actually looks really fun. Let's take a look-see here with the artificial lighting. Oh gosh, I think Astral White just absolutely brought this look to a whole new level of awesome. I don't know whether you can see the sparkles that are coming from Astral White over that green eyeshadow. Obviously Astral White over the taupe we've seen a multitude of times, but that Astral White over the green is just absolutely blowing my mind, and I'm so annoyed because that you can still see that line a little bit here. Oh well, when I open my eyes you can't really see it. So I decided to fully play into those cooler tones and kept it also very like cool neutral beige taupe on my lips with Suzanne's Sunset, which is one of the mattes from Gucci. It looks like this. Absolutely love this lipstick, absolutely love the formula, like the matte lipstick formula from Gucci, and I cannot tell you how much I really like this look. I think it turned out so incredibly pretty. I love the combination of the taupe and the green with the lipstick and my beige, you know, turtleneck. It just all played out really well. I hope that you enjoyed this super rambly video and my book recommendations, and I was somewhat coherent throughout the video, because you know what happens sometimes, I'll be editing the video and I think, oh, you know, I think I expressed myself pretty well, and then I'll go edit the video and I'll be like, Mariam, this makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So I gotta tell you, doing your makeup while talking is actually more difficult than it seems. So I hope that I was somewhat coherent and you enjoyed the ramblings and the recommendations. Either way, if you got at least the titles of the books and a little bit what they're about, I will leave them also in the description box below. I highly recommend to go and read all of them, because they're all really, really interesting if you have any, you know, affinity to the topic. Don't forget to let me know what you thought about this look, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!